The world is on a knife edge. There's over 100 armed conflicts currently taking place right across the globe. Some of these are new, others have been going on for decades, but each episode will break down everything you need to know to understand the battles shaping the world today. Welcome to the War Zone. I'm Maddie Hale. On today's episode, we are diving straight into the latest conflict coming out of the Russia-Ukraine war. While the war began in 2014, when Vladimir Putin began his master plan to take over Ukraine by occupying the eastern region of Crimea, the latest conflict began in February 2022. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine over 2 years ago, over 220,000 people have died, 9,000 in this year alone. The situation has escalated in the last week, with the Russian army entering the northeastern city of Vovchansk, leading to fears that Putin's military could be close to occupying Kharkiv, the second largest city in Ukraine. Is this latest offensive from Russia a game-changing success for the Kremlin? Here to discuss this with me is former British Colonel Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. Hamish, thanks so much for your time today. Russia has claimed that they've entered the northeastern city of Volchansk. What does the situation look like now for residents of that area? Has there been a lot of death and destruction already?
I think this is a hugely significant time with the Russians' advances in that area and, of course, also towards Kharkiv. And it's against the backdrop of delayed massive amounts of American military hardware, and also the potential that in the next sort of month or two, F-16s are going to arrive. And it looks like the Russians have really put an enormous amount of effort into the attacks in the east here and making some considerable progress. Only today, President Zelensky has cancelled all his overseas trips, really highlighting the potential of this incursion here. So I think it is hugely significant. It is clear that Ukrainian military morale, particularly on the front line, has been wavering a bit. It's been a really long, hard winter and spring, and seeing Russia potentially taking up to 9 villages in this area, shelling Kharkiv with many casualties. And Kharkiv is a massive city. I mean, it is the second city of Ukraine. And I think it's something that we in the West, particularly NATO and hopefully the US as well, are looking at very closely, because also the head of intelligence of Ukraine is suggesting that actually Ukraine was taken a little bit by surprise from some of these incursions, which to me is a huge worry, because although we might not have NATO boots on the ground in Ukraine at the moment, it's our intelligence assets hoovering up everything that's happening that should be feeding Ukraine all it needs. So this shouldn't have been a surprise. So I think it's very, very, very significant and a seminal moment for the West. We've got to act now and really lean into this. Otherwise, Russia could make some serious advances on the back of their current attacks around Kharkiv and the other villages, which could well bring NATO and the UK much closer into this war in Ukraine.
Hamish, on that note, obviously Zelensky, as you said, he's not going to Spain and Portugal. He's staying in Ukraine for what's been happening. Obviously, that highlights that this situation is severe. A lot of people would say that this is just a stepping stone, this latest, occupation to gaining control of Kharkiv. And as you said, it's the second largest city. It's got a population of 1.4 million people. How likely is it, do you think, that Russia will capture Kharkiv, and how significant would that be as an advantage for Russia?
Oh, the capture of Kharkiv would be a key and seminal moment in this war. As you say, 1.4 million. Now, how likely is that? I think at the moment that would be a worst case scenario. If Kharkiv fell to the Russians, then it's very much in the balance whether NATO would need to get demonstrably involved. And that, when I say that, I mean boots in the ground and boots in the air, as it were, because with that taken, if there was a significant collapse in morale in Ukraine, and you could see that, one just had, town the size, or a city the size of Birmingham, if that was taken, that would absolutely, shake the foundations of this country. So I think it would shake the foundations of Ukraine, and we cannot stand by and let that happen. Now, part of this is also, I expect, a massive deception move by the Russians to try and draw Ukrainian forces around from the sort of middle of Ukraine, looking down into Crimea, where perhaps Russia is very concerned they might break through. But whatever it is, this is a really serious situation. And I think European leaders, NATO leaders, and the US need to make it quite clear to Putin that actually this would tip the balance. This would get NATO troops involved. Now, there will be various scalings here. I think to begin with, it would mean that NATO would have to help out in the sort of air war, as it were. And as we've discussed before, if Britain is happy to shoot down Iranian missiles fired at Israeli cities, and Iran is not a direct threat to the UK, then to me, it's incomprehensible that we wouldn't shoot down Russian missiles fired at Ukraine cities, because Russia is a direct threat to the UK at the moment. Russia is creating the potential for war in Europe. That would include the UK. And I think the fall of Kharkiv could be a key element to making that happen. So, yeah, I think we are really on the tips of our toes here. And something like this could really change the whole metric and dynamic and get us more closely involved. Because if Kharkiv falls, if morale falls, and the Russians start steaming quickly westwards, then very, very quickly we've got to address the defense of the west of Europe. Because I think nobody who studies this closely believes that Putin will stop at Europe. And nobody who listened to Putin's speech on the 9th of May and understood it now realizes that actually, Ukraine is an enabling objective, if we call it in military strategy terms. The key objective for Putin is conflict, or certainly dressing down NATO. That's what he's going to do. That's what he's been telling us for years now.
So, Hamish, are you saying that the Ukrainian army can't, can't kind of get the upper hand on making sure Kharkiv is not captured without the help of NATO, without the help of its Western alliance? It can't, control this area by itself?
Well, let's hope it can. And as I said, we always look at the worst case scenario. But the worst case scenario is usually also the most unlikely. And the best case scenario, in the best case, Ukraine will be able to divert troops to this area, will be able to make sure that there is enough, missiles and artillery holding back the Russians. We keep hearing that actually the Russians don't have the logistics, the ammunition, the fuel, and the manpower to do very much more than it's doing at the moment. But, if you'd asked me this question 2 weeks ago, whether Kharkiv would be under threat, I would probably be saying I'd be really surprised if it was. So I think, war is a very fluid activity, and we must be on the balls of our feet. So that in the worst case scenario, Ukraine might not be able to hold Kharkiv. And as I think Kharkiv falling would be a key moment in this battle that would change the whole dynamics in NATO and Britain's support to Ukraine, because I think that would absolutely draw us in. So indirectly, as it were, we must do all that we can to ensure that Russia does not take Kharkiv and give Ukraine the wherewithal, be it intelligence, and also hurry all those heavy American ammunition and military capability in as quickly as possible. And let's hope that those F-16s are closer to the horizon than at the moment we believe they might be.
Hamish, it's obviously clear that in the last few days, Russia's army have made significant headway, as you say. This is a game changer, if you will, to occupy and take this area on the north, on the border, but also take Kharkiv, as you say. Russia is already occupying 18% of Ukraine. If it takes Kharkiv, it's a large majority. If you're looking at this and just looking at the facts, is it safe to say that Russia is winning this war and will win this war?
Well, I think Russia has, the way that the Western leaders have approached Putin have given him the confidence to get on the front foot, to get on the offensive. Really throughout the winter and for the last sort of year or so, it's been pretty much stalemate along that front defensive line called the Sorokin line. So, I think Putin thinks that Europe doesn't have the stomach for the fight. There's been so much talk about other things, mainly elections in Europe. A lot of European countries have been very slow to fill up the ammunition dumps in Ukraine. And for Putin, that he takes that as us not being interested, and really emboldens him to crack on. So absolutely, I think this is an absolutely key time, and those Western leaders who hitherto have been more concerned about their elections later this year, quite frankly, better wake up, because if they don't, and if Kharkiv falls, I think we'll all be going to the recruiting centres, not the polling stations, later on this year. So the next few months are more critical, I would suggest, than any of the months in the war, really, from the very first few weeks when it looked like Kyiv might fall. So, having Kharkiv fall, to me, is just something that cannot be allowed to happen. And if it does happen, the possibility of us all being engaged in a war of Europe becomes so much more likely.
It is key. Okay, this area is the next stage. But Hamish, you're obviously a former British colonel. A hypothetical situation, you're still working as a top colonel in the British Army. Would you be sending British soldiers boots on the ground to Ukraine right now?
I think the boots on the ground issue for NATO troops in Ukraine is very emotive. I tend to agree with President Macron, who is very keen to put this on the table. Unfortunately, our own Foreign Secretary, Lord Cameron, dismissed this some weeks ago. Now, it's in military strategy, the worst thing you can do is to tell your enemy what you're doing and what you're not going to do. And I think the fact that we've so clearly signaled to Russia that we don't intend to put boots on the ground really has, that has shaped Putin's thinking. And because of that, we're now in a position where we really must think about putting boots on the ground. Certainly, NATO aircraft, if we can allow Ukraine to get air parity, that sort of, allows them to maneuver in the air. At least that will make a significant difference, because at the moment, Russia's got air superiority and can, really do what it likes. And, if Kharkiv falls, then NATO is going to have to block Russia further westwards. Now, it is probably better to block Russia in Ukraine rather than give them that momentum of charging across Ukraine to hit the border of NATO, as it were. So the plans must be in place to do that. And, I am sure that there are plans being made for exactly this. They're not the most likely, but they are the worst case. So, yeah, we must look at that. I think people in this country must realise what a serious position we're in. I think, back in 1939, people in this country did not think we'd been involved in a war with Hitler in Europe. Now, Putin is cut of the same cloth as Hitler. He wants to dominate Europe. And we've got to absolutely realise that that's the case. And, we have got to make sure that we put out the right signals to Putin that we will not allow him to, take Kharkiv and start steaming westwards. I think it's really that serious at the moment. And, when Zelensky decides not to travel, and he's done a great job of globetrotting around the world to get support, but if he feels it's too dangerous for him to get out of Kyiv, then we need to take serious note of that.
Well, on that note, Hamish, Zelensky, he's pleaded yet again with international partners, stating that Ukraine's air defence must be strengthened. You and I have spoken about air control at great lengths. What is the actual technology, the actual military air equipment that Ukraine needs to be able to stay in control and avoid Kharkiv being taken by Russia?
Well, first of all, it's about ammunition. It's about air defense missiles. People have heard of Patriot and other type of these missiles, and they're very expensive and they're getting used up. I mean, what Russia is doing in this war is using what we call mass. In other words, as much as possible, thousands of tanks, thousands of drones, thousands of missiles, and what that does is really sort of overload the defensive situation. Nobody before this war envisaged that somebody would use thousands of drones and you again need thousands of missiles to knock them down. And that is the issue. It's a pure numbers and mass game. The other element, the air defense, of course, are the fighter jets, which Ukraine has not had. We know that these F-16s are just about ready. And the F-16 should vastly overmatch, what Russia has. But it is a key element to it. But this is something that people, in this, in NATO and this country, are learning sort of almost on the hoof. This air defense piece, the last sort of wars and battles I were involved in, air defense wasn't a huge issue. Now it is absolutely fundamental to it. So the delay of that £61 billion worth of American military aid has been hugely significant because a lot of those air defense stocks have absolutely been honed down to a bare minimum. So it is really, again, I talk about mass. Russia's got mass. We don't. And at the moment, it is massive of air defense missiles, massive fighter jets that Ukraine needs to hold Russia. And it's the person that holds on longest that will prevail. And, only this week, Putin has sacked his defense chief, Shoigu, and brought in an economist who has absolutely no military experience. But the inference here is that Putin wants his economy putting absolutely on a war footing so that he can make more missiles, more tanks, more artillery shells, more fighter jets than NATO and keep holding on, because he knows the longer that he can hold on, the more likely that the parliaments in Europe will appease him because they just don't have the stomach to keep going and would prefer to see Ukraine fall. But what they really are not getting is that Ukraine won't be the end of it if Ukraine does fall.
Well, on that note, Hamish, with you said Putin, he's replaced his defence minister with an economist. As you said, that's an unprecedented move, but it's very timely in what's happening in Russia, kind of prompting speculation that Russia, is having economic issues. They've put a lot of their GDP into military. Do you think that Vladimir Putin is budgeting for a World War III, an all-out war?
Well, that's what he's saying. That's what he said on the 9th of May. And, that is what he has been saying for the last 2 years, probably longer. It's just that we've chosen to ignore it, stick our heads in the sand. And, to put an economist who absolutely has no military experience, but apparently is very good at what he does, as a bean counter, really focuses on absolutely, he is preparing for the long term here. And, he said in his 9th of May speech, virtually in clear language, that he was preparing his forces to face down NATO. And, that all the indications are. You've got tractor factories being turned into tank lines. But I think, another thing that we learned this week is actually recruits are really becoming a bit of an issue for Putin, not least, 400,000 casualties seems to be the figure people are talking about. And there is talk that Putin is going to have to start recruiting from the elites of St. Petersburg and Moscow, the White Russians, as it were, because the hundreds of thousands of ethnic Russians from the East, those recruits are drying up. And I think that will really completely change the metric. Once those educated and wealthy people in those countries, those cities rather, start seeing their young men coming back in boxes, that might well change the metric rather quickly, more quickly than anything else.
Well, Hamish, I want to stay on this conscription because this is an interesting point that I want to bring up, and I think it goes to show how committed Putin is to winning this all-out war and staying in it for the long haul, but also definitely showing that comparison between him and Hitler and that dictatorial nature that they both have. But I want to read you this quote from The Telegraph that we've spoken about earlier this week. The Telegraph reported, "We can now definitively say, after much research, that Moscow has been conscripting Ukrainian youth from across the occupied territories to serve in the army. Not only that, but Ukrainian intelligence has recorded many cases in which conscripts have ended up on the front lines. This is not just a moral crime, but a war crime." Putin is literally making Ukrainians in occupied areas fight for Russia's army. What do you think this says about this man?
Well, simply it says, he's completely morally bankrupt. This is the sort of thing Hitler did. And, as I said, they are cut of the same cloth. In these illegally occupied areas, I cannot believe that many, if any, of these Ukrainian men have volunteered to go into the front line. They will be there, made to attack their country folk. And I expect if they turn around, that they'll get shot, because that's the way the Russian army works. They have a group, units behind the front line, who basically anybody who turns around and doesn't want to fight are forced to go back or they're shot. So yeah, I mean, absolutely, this is a war crime. It shows the desperation. It shows that Putin is prepared to put anybody in the front line. I think again, this is something that we in the liberal West need to get hold of. Putin has absolutely no concern about civilian casualties or military casualties, even his own. He is only interested in the end state, and that is securing Ukraine, in his view, back to the old sort of Soviet Union. And he sees nothing getting in his way. Yeah. Ultimately, he's getting an old man now, and he wants to be seen as the second Peter the Great before he's finished. Interestingly enough, some of the reshuffling going on in the Kremlin at the moment might also suggest that some of his fellow gangsters are getting a little bit nervous as well. But, be under no illusion that there is nothing that Putin won't do to try and achieve success. And using Ukrainian conscripts to fight their own people, no doubt under the sword, is just another example of what he's prepared to do.
Also goes to show that, it calls into question, I guess, how many followers Putin really has. And as you said, he's getting older, he's in his 70s. You never know how many followers he'll have once he, passes on. But I want to stick with what's happening this week. Now, Hamish, just a final question for you. China's Xi Jinping is hosting Putin on Thursday, 2 years after declaring that they had a no-limits partnership, with what we were speaking about before with, hiring an economist as opposed to a defence minister. Do you think that Putin could ever turn to China for financial help to keep this war going?
Well, in effect, he is. The Chinese are buying most of Russia hydrocarbons, oil and gas at the moment, replacing that used to go to the West. So, of course, that is very important money going into the Russian economy. Most of the high tech in Russian weaponry hitherto came from the West, and sanctions are beginning to bite. It would appear that, China is filling some of that gap. And China is, trying to change the world order. It wants to see itself as the superpower. At the moment, there is only one real superpower, and that's the US. Yeah. And China wants to be along that. China has no scruples about dealing with, some of the dictatorial countries around the world: Russia, Belarus, North Korea, Venezuela. It's just trying to exert influence. But I think that the one thing that we must keep in the back of our mind is, of course, that the biggest market for China is the European Union, the UK, and the US. Yeah. Russia, although has become more significant, is still fairly small. So it's good to hear the US really putting the pressure on Beijing, as the UK should as well. But at the moment, China is being very unhelpful and keeping, the coffers of Russia stoked up. And that's, a huge concern that we must not take our eye off.
Yes, they are, toying with both, obviously helping Russia with their economy while being way too reliant on the West's investment. So it would probably be too tricky to get in bed completely with Russia. But Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, thank you so much for your time today.
Pleasure.